They will change the course of our nation to the benefit of all American citizens and truly make our country great again. It is therefore my honor to nominate Ohio Senator JD Vance for the office of Vice President of the United States of America.
Delegates and alternates, pursuant to Rule 40A, a motion to nominate by acclamation is now in order. The chair now recognizes Delegate Bernie Moreno, Senate candidate from Ohio, for the purpose of making a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Bernie Moreno. I'm honored to be the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate from the great state of Ohio. I know firsthand that my dear friend JD is a selfless and brilliant fighter. He is a patriot who loves America. He loves Ohio. He loves his family. He's a great father. He's a great man. And that's what we need in this nation today. The JD Vance, America First, is not just a slogan. It's his North Star. He has followed it every moment of his life and career. He knows what it's like to live in poverty, forgotten by Washington politicians. He is dedicated to ensure that no American is ever forgotten again. Madam Chair, it is a great honor to move that JD Vance be nominated by acclamation by this Republican National Convention as its candidate for the office of Vice President of the United States of America.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion that Senator JD Vance be nominated by acclamation. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Delegates and alternates, ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to announce that Senator JD Vance has the overwhelming support of this convention to be the next Vice President of the United States. The chair is pleased to make the following appointments to the Escort Committee for Senator JD Vance, his vice presidential nominee. Usha Vance, thank you, and God bless America.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Speaker Johnson.
All right. What a great night. Pursuant to Rule 40D of the rules of the Republican Party, I formally declare President Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance as the Republican nominees for President and Vice President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back RNC Chairman Michael Whatley.
What a great afternoon for the Republican Party, and what a great afternoon for America. It is now time to take the official convention photograph. If all of the delegates would please stand and turn to the center camera directly opposite the stage, we will take the official photograph.
I'm Hallie Jackson, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, and you have just been watching the ticket now becoming official for the Republican Party, with Senator JD Vance now formally becoming former President Donald Trump's pick to be his running mate. You heard Speaker Mike Johnson announce it there, and you saw those moments of Senator Vance, and you're looking at him live now on the left side of your screen on the convention floor. The hugs, the selfies, the waves, the high fives. This is now the ticket. Trump, Vance. We've already seen some of the images of the campaign plane getting repainted. You've seen folks on the convention floor writing Vance's name in Sharpie on those Trump Vance signs tonight. It is a significant moment now in this campaign. And I want to get right to our Garrett Hake, who's down on the floor. Garrett, give us a sense of what you've seen and how close you are to the new vice presidential candidate.
Hallie, I'm pretty far back in the crowd here now with my people here in the Texas delegation, but you don't have to be close to JD Vance to understand the excitement that he's generating for this ticket. I mean, if you think about where we are in this race, you've got a race between two such known commodities, frankly, so disliked by partisans on the other side, people so dug in and so well known about the two candidates at the top of the ticket. JD Vance represents an unknown. For Republicans, they see him as a breath of fresh air. For Democrats, he's sort of a new figure that they're going to look for a handle on to try to attack, but you heard it here in the room. You certainly felt it on the floor, those chants of JD for a nominee who will go by his initials. And I think sort of like that grassroots enthusiasm that you alluded to with scribbling his name in on the signs, which I think is also a point about how tightly the Trump campaign wanted to control this moment, control this announcement, to bottle up this energy and use it exactly as they could, Hallie.
And you have seen those moments, the cheers, that ovation for Senator Vance as his name was announced. I'm joined, of course, by our moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, who is here with me, elevated now from the floor, Kristen. And to Garrett's point here, this was a carefully choreographed rollout here, with the former president apparently calling J.D. Vance only about 20 minutes before that public announcement, according to a source familiar.
That's right. And Hallie, this is a decision that he grappled with for quite some time. There was a sense that in the wake of the assassination attempt against him that he grappled with it some more. This is a significant pick. It's a generational pick. He is 39 years old. He's only been in the Senate for 2 years. And so there are questions about how he helps electorally, but this is the pick.
Thank you so much. We're going to stand by now for an NBC News special report right now.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air from breaking news. Former President Trump his pick for vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance has officially been nominated. The senator from Ohio is now officially on the ticket. Mr. Trump announced his nominee earlier today, and according to NBC News sources, only called him 20 minutes before making the announcement. That came just moments before the Republican convention officially nominated Mr. Trump as their nominee for president. I'm here at the White House this afternoon because I just interviewed President Biden. I asked him about Vance. We'll have some of that interview in just a moment. But first, let's get to Vaughn Hilliard on the convention floor in Milwaukee. Vaughn?
Lester, just moments ago, the author of Hillbilly Elegy and the senator who was elected just 18 months ago. He was formally, by the voice vote of acclamation here by the more than 2,000 delegates here in downtown Milwaukee, to be the running mate and vice presidential candidate to Donald Trump. J.D. Vance, the Ohio senator, just moments ago coming in here to greet members of the Ohio delegation here before making his way out. He is slated to make his vice presidential acceptance speech on Wednesday night, before Donald Trump makes his acceptance speech on Thursday night. I was talking to a Senate colleague of J.D. Vance who told me that he was on the phone with Donald Trump just earlier this morning. This was Tommy Tuberville, a senator from Alabama. He said he was on the phone with him this morning, Donald Trump, when Trump indicated to him that he was still making his determination, about over here. Lester, I would send it back to you.
All right, Vaughn, thank you. Turning now to that first look at my exclusive interview with President Biden moments ago here at the White House. I asked the president about heated political rhetoric after he called on all Americans to tone it down in a primetime Oval Office address last night, which was in response to Saturday night's assassination attempt on former President Trump. Right now, we have President Biden's first reaction in an unscripted setting. Here's part of our conversation. Well, let's talk about the conversation this has started, and it's really about language, what we say out loud and the consequences of those. You called your opponent an existential threat on a call a week ago. You said it's time to put Trump in the bullseye. There's some dispute about the context, but I think you appreciate that.
I didn't say crosshairs. I was talking about focus on. Look, the truth of the matter was, what I guess I was talking about at the time was, there was very little focus on Trump's agenda.
Yeah, the term was bullseye.
It was a mistake to use the word. I didn't say crosshairs. I meant bullseye. I meant focus on him. Focus on what he's doing. Focus on his policies. Focus on the number of lies he told in the debate. Focus. I mean, there's a whole range of things that, look, I'm not the guy that said, I want to be a dictator on day one. I'm not the guy that refused to accept the outcome of the election. I'm not the guy who said that won't accept the outcome of this election automatically. You can't only love your country when you win. And so the focus was on what he's saying, and I mean, the idea.
But have you taken a step back and done a little soul searching on things that you may have said that could incite people who are not balanced?
Well, I don't think, look, how do you talk about the threat to democracy, which is real, when a president says things like he says? Do you just not say anything because it may incite somebody? Look, I've not engaged in that rhetoric. Now, my opponent is engaged in that rhetoric. He talks about there'll be a bloodbath if he loses, talking about how he's going to forgive all the, actually, I guess, suspend the sentences of all those who were arrested and sentenced to go to jail because of what happened in the Capitol. I'm not out there making fun of, like, remember the picture of Donald Trump when Nancy Pelosi's husband was hit with a hammer, joking about it?
That's part of my conversation with the president here at the White House. We'll have much more of it. The exclusive interview tonight on NBC Nightly News. Also, we'll air the full unedited version in a primetime special at 9 p.m. Eastern. And don't miss our coverage of the first night of the Republican National Convention, which kicks off at 9:30 Eastern Time. That concludes this NBC News special report. I'm Lester Holt. Thank you for watching.
You have been watching that NBC News special report. I'm Hallie Jackson, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee with these big breaking news updates in the presidential election. Not just what you just saw, Lester's exclusive interview with President Biden at this critical moment in the race, just about 48 hours, too, after the attempted assassination of his political rival, former President Donald Trump, and just minutes, of course, simultaneously, likely, as the rollout was happening for the former president's running mate, who we now know officially is Senator JD Vance. Both men formally nominated. They are no longer the presumptive ticket. They are the official ticket here this hour. And you can see that moment where Senator Vance came walking out, accompanied by his wife, our Jacob Soboroff, trying to get that question in. I want to bring in now some of the folks who are joining us here as we continue our breaking news coverage. Tom Yamas is here with us in the booth. Kristen Welker is here with us in the booth. And I want to start with that interview with President Biden and Lester Holt, where you heard the president say that it was a mistake to use the word bullseye. This is a word that, a phrase that the president had said apparently in a donor call or a private call about a week ago that some conservatives pointed to in the aftermath of this attempted assassination, Kristen.
They did, and it was notable to hear him try to clarify those remarks. He said, look, I was saying let's put the focus on his policies. He then went on to draw a pretty sharp contrast with the former president as it relates to the different ways in which they speak about this moment. He talked about the fact that former President Trump has used language that has been viewed as being violent rhetoric by some. And so I thought that was notable. He's not backing away from drawing that contrast, but I think that's where this becomes complicated for President Biden. How does he continue to strike that note of unity that he struck in the Oval Office, in his Oval Office address, and at the same time try to draw that sharp contrast while he tries to win the White House back again? So remember, Donald Trump saying he's changing his speech here at the Republican National Convention. He says it's going to be a more unifying speech. He says he was saved by God after that assassination attempt. It will be Very interesting to see what that means from Donald Trump's perspective. But we are learning that from the perspective of President Biden, he's not backing away from drawing that very sharp contrast as it relates to political rhetoric,
Just an
Hallie.
extraordinary confluence of events here on the start of what is a critical week in any presidential campaign, but especially so on this one. Tom, fresh back from Butler, Pennsylvania, of course, the site of that attempted assassination against former President Trump, something that has permeated this convention, even with that typical party atmosphere you might normally see. Those cheers for JD Vance as he came walking out, the theatrics of the rollout of that VP pick. And yet some delegates, one telling our team, you know, his family was a little concerned about him coming here to Milwaukee, but he wanted to be here to show support for this Republican ticket as it is now official.
You know, it's kind of strange times we're living in right now. Just 2 days ago, a former president was almost assassinated. Yeah. And there has been so much news. We're now talking about his running mate, right? It's almost, I don't want to say we forgot.
And by the way,
it.
the federal classified documents case. That was
the federal classified documents case as well. There's so much news. People always say sometimes former President Trump can step on his own news cycle. But from talking to people who are familiar with his decision, he wanted to be completely in control of this moment. And I think he is right now. I think for a lot of Republicans, the choice of JD Vance, and you guys have said this, is to sort of reinvigorate, to make sure that that MAGA mantle is passed on. And it's funny, you walk into this convention center, and when I walked in, the first thing you see is just red hats, red T-shirts, red jackets. It's all MAGA all the time. Yeah. And I have new reporting. I understand there were deep conversations in the family, and there was a split in the Trump family, right? There were members of the Trump family that were pushing hard for Senator Marco Rubio, and then there were members of the Trump family that were pushing hard for Senator JD Vance. We know that Don Jr. ultimately won that argument, which is interesting. And he went public with it. He essentially said, listen, Senator Marco Rubio is a very talented senator, but he's also the establishment. You know, he is not like us. He is not the MAGA movement, even though he has a close relationship with the Trump family. And ultimately, former President Trump listened to him. The interesting part is that even the First Lady, I understand, weighed in on this conversation. And you saw that the statement she put out there, she wanted to tone the rhetoric down. And I bring this up because the choice of JD Vance is interesting because JD Vance does not tone it down. JD Vance was the first one out there who was attacking President Biden. He will be the bulldog. Yeah. Not that Donald Trump needs a bulldog, but he will be the bulldog in this scenario. And let me tell you something else. Don't be surprised if former President Trump sort of, I don't want to say sits back, but if he takes a step back, tries to be more measured, and he lets Senator Vance do all his dirty work.
Yeah, what's so fascinating about Tom's reporting is the fact that the divide in the family is the divide that the Republican Party was having and Trump allies were having about J.D. Vance. This concern that doubling down on MAGA could be too risky. Does it help electorally? You heard Governor Scott Walker in the previous hour argue, no, actually, it may help in the Midwest, but Marco Rubio is someone who has foreign policy experience, and he's seen as someone who can fundraise in an extremely robust way.
And in some of my conversations with sources, there was the thinking, right, and Tom, you referenced this, that Senator Vance could help with turnout in some of these critical Rust Belt states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I want to go to our colleague Gabe Gutierrez, who has some reporting for us after that exclusive interview between President Biden and Lester Holt. And this issue, Gabe, of threats to democracy, the way that the Biden campaign has framed this race as existential in so many ways.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And look, you were just talking about it with Tom, and we just heard in that clip from Lester's interview, look, it's clear that President Biden doesn't plan on really changing his messaging. But what's interesting is that earlier this afternoon, the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was pressed on this by reporters. And what she was trying to argue was that it is legitimate to call out someone's agenda and even their character. Reporters pressed her, though, what about the language, calling somebody a threat to democracy? That, many people consider, is going that extra step. Now, Karine Jean-Pierre didn't have a strong answer on that. The only thing she said is that the Biden campaign, or Biden administration, did not want to politicize the moment, but she would not commit to the president changing his language at all. And we just heard from the president himself, it doesn't seem like he's modifying it at all. As you and Tom have been discussing, will be interesting to see how former President Trump's speech at this convention, if he changes his rhetoric at all. But as of now, it seems like the president, the Biden administration, they are still continuing to use that language that some people argue may have contributed to the moment that we're in now.
Can I bring up a point, though, following Gabe's reporting? And I was watching you two watching the Biden interview. We can't forget the reason why President Biden is doing that interview is to show America that he can be the commander-in-chief, that he can stand another 4 years. And let's be very honest here. when you watch the president speak, even in this setting, even in the middle of the day, you have to really listen to understand and to follow him. At points, he was trying to make a valid point, which he was trying to say that former President Trump turns up the temperature, and maybe he shouldn't have said what he said, but it took him so long to sort of get there. And I think the American people are watching that as well. Whether it's right or whether it's wrong, America's now obviously talking about what happened to former President Trump.
Democrats are watching it very closely as well.
You're right, and part of the criticism around those close to President Biden is that if Americans perhaps had seen the president more regularly, you might be used to those kind of cadences. We have seen a lot of different presidents speak in a lot of different ways stylistically. But of course, as you well know, both of you, there had been a critique that simply the president wasn't put out there enough. He wasn't put on the stage enough. He was, in effect, essentially, quote unquote, bubble wrapped. I want to just nod to what's happening right now. If you've noticed, we no longer have to shout over the music that is playing on the stage behind us here, and that is because we're in a bit of a lull. You saw the big moment of the day, the big opener of the convention, that critical roll call officially nominating former President Trump and Ohio Senator JD Vance, now officially the Trump-Vance ticket. Looks a little different now. The vibes are a little different. People are milling around. It's a bit of a break before we head into the next session. That is the key primetime session. And of course, the question, we have seen JD Vance. Will we see Donald Trump? I want to go down to the floor for a second, because now you can actually probably hear what Vaughn Hilliard has to say. Vaughn, I understand you're with the delegate down there. Talk us through it.
Right. This is essentially the dinner break here before those primetime speeches come in. And of course, there was a lot of anticipation over who that VP running mate was going to be. I was told that he was making up his mind as soon as this morning, which left sort of the big question mark for all the delegates as well. I want to introduce you to Leanne, Pat, and Mary, North Carolina delegates. Mary, when did you first become familiar with who JD Vance was?
When I read his book, Hillbilly.
And now he is the vice presidential running mate for Donald Trump. What do you make of that selection?
I think he's got a broad experience, life experience. He's particularly involved with the military, which I think is very important, which we haven't had in an administration in several years. And that's going to be more important as time marches on. He has a broad experience with coming up from a humble background and moving into all areas of our family and social issues and social life. So
was this generally well received?
Yes. And Trump likes surprises. You know, he does like surprises.
And you guys trust Donald Trump's pick?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You guys, thank you. Enjoy the rest of the week. All righty. Hallie, guys.
Vaughn Hilliard down there on the floor. And listen, people come for in part, the theatrics of this moment. And you look at people, you referenced it, Tom, people dressed in red, almost uniformly, sort of echoing what we've often seen from former President Trump. It's a moment here for people to come together. And in so many ways, this convention is Donald Trump's stamp on the Republican Party. His grip on the Republican Party is very clear.
It is, Hallie, and think about how much more unified the Republican Party is than the first time that Donald Trump won the nomination back in 2016, when you had Ted Cruz, who delivered a speech back.
We were all there, I think, in the convention hall. Yeah, exactly.
Endorse him when he delivered his speech. This is a very different moment. Yes, such a different moment for so many reasons, because Donald Trump has unified this party largely, and because, again, we sit here in the wake of that assassination attempt. We cannot overstate the massive impact, I think, that it will have on this election, on this moment. And of course, the big question, what will that mean for Donald Trump's speech? What will it mean for this race? I go back to the point that Tom was just making, which is we were watching President Biden's comments so closely because there is this big debate in the Democratic Party about whether he should continue to be the nominee. And the debate felt like it was reaching a fever pitch until the assassination attempt. Now, it seems, at least for now, it has been stalled a bit. We'll have to see if they pick back up with that debate, Tom. But that's why we make the point. Everyone's watching President Biden's interview with Lester very carefully, including and especially Democrats.
I got to tell you, it is so weird to be here just because we came and we left Butler, Pennsylvania this morning. Sadness, grief, confusion. a community that's been rocked. Yeah. And there's a lot of people at home that watch that and live that with everyone else. And you come here, and I don't want to say people have forgotten it, because they have not, but it is just so weird to kind of see both those worlds that are happening simultaneously. The Republicans obviously have to put on a convention. They have to be excited about this. On the point of Senator JD Vance, you know, just like every other running mate, America's going to have to get to know him. If you don't follow politics, if you're not hardcore Republican, you probably don't know who Senator JD Vance is. To me, the most fascinating calculation that former President Trump, I think, made is that he looked at the electoral map, right? He's polling a little bit better with Hispanics and blacks than he did before. He's peeling away a little bit from President Biden. The thinking was if he gets Senator Marco Rubio, he could maybe pull in some more Hispanic voters. You'd have a running mate who can give interviews fully in Spanish. You could hit all those Spanish markets. Also, some of the establishment likes him as well. But he picked Senator J.D. Vance, and you guys have made this point because of sort of that blue wall, right? Those Midwestern states. So you must think they're looking at the map and they're thinking Western Pennsylvania, where this just happened, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. Those are the states that are going to decide this. It's those voters that are going to decide this, and maybe that's more important.
And you're right, and I think we'll pay such close attention to those voters, and it's also a generational pick. The fact that he's 39 years old, the fact that so many Americans are saying they're fed up with this rematch. This is a fresh face, to your point.
It is a good point.
People will be learning about him for the first time.
One of the other interesting pieces to this, though, is that folks who maybe didn't follow politics or don't follow politics might have known about J.D. Vance because he had a level of fame and celebrity because of his book, because of Hillbilly Elegy. And it was interesting to hear that delegate tell Vaughn that is how J.D. Vance's name first came on our radar. Of course, it was a very different, from a political sense, J.D. Vance. During that era, he has had a dramatic shift in the way that he talks about Donald Trump and the way that he positions himself against the former president. And you are already seeing the Biden campaign take aim at that. You can bet that is going to be a key line of attack from the Biden folks. And if we do end up seeing a debate between those vice presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and J.D. Vance, sure to come up. We're going to sneak in a very quick break while the delegates are taking their dinner break. But don't go anywhere. We've got a lot of folks to talk to, making some news when we come back right here during our special coverage alongside Tom Yamas and Kristen Welker right here on NBC News Now. We are back live at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. You have been watching all of this unfold, the nomination officially of what we now know is the Trump-Vance ticket. All of it, of course, against the backdrop of that attempted assassination against former President Trump just about 48 hours ago. You are now seeing, of course, on the backdrop of all of this in Milwaukee, protesters marching through downtown against the Republican agenda, demonstrating against that as the convention's getting started today, with the organizers making a deal with the city to be near the arena where the convention's happening. Protesters say they were unfazed by what happened on Saturday, that shooting at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. NBC's Maggie Vespa has been marching with some of those demonstrators. She is joining us now. Talk to us about what you heard, what you saw, and how that assassination attempt played into their thinking, if at all, to come here to Milwaukee today.
Yeah, Hallie, it was definitely top of mind, which will shock no one. I mean, looking at that video, and by our own estimates, we had easily over 1,000 people marching through a very hot, very muggy Milwaukee. It's pretty much died down, as you can see here, but the video is striking. The name of this event is called the Coalition to March on the RNC 2024. And as you said, they're kind of holistically protesting the entire GOP agenda, a number of issues, as we'll walk through in a bit. But you know, obviously, again, top of mind, safety for them, just like for everyone else. Obviously, those people felt well enough to come out and protest, to come out and march and participate in this event, which has been planned for months, if not years. But when we asked them about whether or not it was kind of in the back of their minds, whether or not they hesitated or thought twice about coming once they saw what happened over the weekend, we kind of got mixed answers. Here's what one person had to say about sort of how that weighs on her mind as today progressed.
People here are facing violence every day, right? By the denied health care, access to wages, jobs, housing, the policing and militarization of our communities here. That's why people are out here, right? To build a future free of violence.
Yeah, so in short, we heard a lot of that. People saying basically, hey, what you saw over the weekend is, you know, for instance, what a lot of Americans face for people of color or other communities who are more marginalized. They were quick to kind of pivot, in other words, back to the issues. We did hear from a few people who said, yeah, it gave me pause. Someone said, I'm kind of looking up more. Someone said, I'm nervous. I'm glad to see law enforcement out more. For what it's worth, this is the only organized protest this entire week that we know about here in Milwaukee. More could obviously pop up, and more than 100 groups and individuals actually registered with this city. But no one's been putting out press releases saying, hey, we're expecting a big crowd. This was on day one. It was largely peaceful, no big disruptions, but definitely mixed emotions out there, Hallie, as people march through.
Maggie Vespa live for us outside the convention center where we are now, of course, where, as you see it over our shoulder, the Republican National Convention is beginning its first day here on Monday. Each night of this convention has a different theme. This is something we've talked about before, notwithstanding, obviously, what you imagine we will, of course, hear about, which is that attempted assassination against former President Trump. Organizers say that they are still essentially full steam ahead, that today's events will be dedicated to the economy in part, an issue that we know from polling is top of mind for most voters. Many Americans say that that is the biggest issue that will get them out to the polls, alongside immigration in some surveys. We also know that the former president has given, and the president, have some broad strokes of their economic plans out. For that, I want to bring in Christine Romans, who is joining us now on all things economy. So, Christine, what's so interesting, let's say we were talking a week ago about this particular night and about these particular speeches and what we expect to hear. It would be, I think, a very different conversation if Saturday obviously had not happened, that attempted assassination against the former president. It will obviously have an impact on the tone tonight. We understand from sources that there are some speakers who are reworking speeches. You also have guidance, apparently, from some organizers that not every speech should or needs to touch on what happened on Saturday. Right. All of that said, we expect the focus on the economy to continue to be a theme tonight. Talk us through how you see the evening unfolding and why it matters so much to Americans.
So inflation and immigration, these are 2 points that the campaign really wants to hit on tonight. And talking about how those two things have really sapped the purchasing power of American families. I think you will hear from people tonight who have been personally affected by a housing crunch in this country and by high mortgage rates and by really high housing costs that have made it very difficult for first-time home buyers to get into the market. So you're going to see them try to make America wealthy again, to try to go back to the Trump years, paint them really as a golden era in the American economy. And also you'll hear this week, I think, but certainly tonight as well, what this presidential candidate would like to do again. Aggressive tariffs, extending those 2017 tax hikes, mass deportations. This is something that he has really promised on the campaign trail. A tighter control over the Federal Reserve. And he has said he wants to make America produce energy again. Well, a few problems here. A lot of economists think that many of these plans would be inflationary, especially the mass deportations, plus very, very disruptive for the American economy. On those higher energy production and cutting regulations, the president was known for cutting a lot of regulations. But I will point out we are on track for record U.S. oil production this year and again next year. The U.S. is drill, baby, drill kind of already here. Also, in terms of the exact policies the president would enact, they're very careful about not giving too many specifics and saying what President Trump says is what the country will do, that it needs to come out of his mouth to be an actual policy. But those tariffs, something the former president called himself tariff man when he was president the first time, that's something that really alarms the business community. Tariffs are essentially taxes that are passed on to consumers, which would raise prices. So that's sort of the broad brushstroke, I think, of where the president stands on, the former president stands on his plans and what you'll hear tonight.
There is clearly a political overlay, Christine. You and I are typically talking during our show in non-convention weeks about this question of what the Fed may do. May they cut interest rates, for example, or looking at how inflation is, looking at those cooling numbers here. Whatever happens between now and the roughly 100 days until Election Day is going to have an impact on this race by that measure as well.
Absolutely. And you know, this is a former president who has been very critical of Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. And you've got a Fed that is basically right on the verge of being able to start cutting interest rates after keeping them very, very high for the past couple of years, painfully high for some businesses and families, and maybe just starting to lower those a little bit heading toward the election. You've got a still sturdy job market. You've got cooling inflation. You've got an economy that is strong but downshift shifting. And so you might be in a position here where the Fed starts to cut interest rates. I will say something that's so interesting. You also have record highs for the Dow. The NASDAQ and the S&P have done very, very well. You know, for typical buy and hold investors, like most people are in their retirement accounts, it has been an amazing 5 or 6 years. The S&P is up 85% over 5 years. So the economy is doing well. Wall Street is doing well. But Main Street investors with money in the stock market have been doing well as well. And I don't think you'll hear much about that tonight.
Christine Romans, always glad to have you. Thank you very much for being with us. I want to bring in now a couple of folks who understand both politics and the economy. That is Mark Short and David Plouffe. Thank you both for being with us. And let me broaden out this conversation. Mark, I'll start with you here on set. If folks don't know you from your work here on NBC News Now, they probably have seen you on CNBC because this is a topic that you are familiar with here from the economic perspective. Talk to me about how you see that having an impact on this race.
Well, I think it is still the driver as far as a lot of the polls say that the economy is number one. Inflation, I think, is something that is 20% over the course of Biden's presidency that I think still hangs over a lot of consumers. And I do believe that much of the Trump tax relief deregulatory agenda helped to accelerate economic growth during the first 4 years of the Trump presidency. But Hallie, as we talked about earlier, the agenda for Trump 2.0 is very different than the economic agenda of Trump 1.0. Trump 2.0 is promising significant tariffs, which I think in the first administration were used targeted to try to bring changes to China. Now we're talking across the board 10% that some estimates say would kill 500,000 jobs even before there's retaliatory tariffs put in place. And I think you have as well a regulatory agenda that could be different. It was very deregulatory in the first administration, but Senator Vance is praised Joe Biden's FTC commissioner, has praised a lot of the regulatory efforts, particularly in the rail industry. And so I think that the Trump 2.0 maybe isn't what Trump 1.0 was as it comes to the economy.
Mark Short, thank you very much. David Plouffe, you're joining us now. It's good to be with you. Let me ask you this, and I want to broaden the conversation to something that we started off this hour with, that NBC News special report, not just on Ohio Senator JD Vance formally receiving that nomination for vice president here at the Republican National Convention, but the first interview now piece of the interview between my colleague Lester Holt, the anchor of Nightly News, and President Biden here, this exclusive. I want to play for folks who may have missed it, part of the conversation, and then I'll come back to you. Here it is.
Well, let's talk about the conversation this has started, and it's really about language, what we say out loud and the consequences of those. You called your opponent an existential threat. On a call a week ago, you said it's time to put Trump in the bullseye. There's some dispute about the context, but I think you appreciate that.
I didn't say
words
crosshairs. I was talking about focus on. Look, the truth of the matter was, what I guess I was talking about at the time was there was very little focus on Trump's agenda.
Yeah, the term was bullseye.
It was a mistake to use the word. I didn't say crosshairs. I meant bullseye. I meant focus on him. Focus on what he's doing. Focus on his policies. Focus on the number of lies he told in the debate. Focus. I mean, there's a whole range of things that, look, I'm not the guy that said I want to be a dictator on day one. I'm not the guy that refused to accept the outcome of the election. I'm not the guy who said that wouldn't accept the outcome of this election automatically. You can't only love your country when you win. And so the focus was on what he's saying, and I mean the idea.
But have you taken a step back and done a little soul searching on things that you may have said that could incite people who are not balanced?
Well, I don't think, look, how do you talk about the threat to democracy, which is real, when a president says things like he says? Do you just not say anything because it may incite somebody? Look, I have not engaged in that rhetoric. Now, my opponent is engaged in that rhetoric. He talks about there'll be a bloodbath if he loses, talking about how he's going to forgive all those, actually, I guess, suspend the sentences of all those who were arrested and sentenced to go to jail because of what happened in the Capitol. I'm not out there making fun of, like, remember the picture of Donald Trump when Nancy Pelosi's husband was hit with a hammer, joking about it.
David, I wonder your reaction to what you've heard now from President Biden.
Well, I think that was a question Lester was definitely going to ask him, and I think that was a good answer. I think I'll be interested this week. There's a lot of head faking going on, and I think some of the media are falling for it that this is going to be a new and gentler Trump. I think his pick of JD Vance would certainly counter that argument. And there's no doubt, listen, Donald Trump's rise and his continued power is in part, in large part, driven by hate and division and derision. So it'd be great if all leaders, this is going to be a fierce campaign, big debates around the economy, as Mark was just talking about, healthcare, immigration, democracy, foreign policy. They should be spirited. Hopefully everybody can be a little careful about their language because of what happened Saturday and really the lead up to that. But at the end of the day, I think, listen, as a former political practitioner, Donald Trump actually would have an easy time this week, saying one or two things that might create a permission structure for voters that are still not voting for him, who may be unhappy with Joe Biden. I doubt he's going to do that. JD Vance is kind of a doubling down of MAGA. And I do think Biden's focus on Trump's record is really important because he is an incumbent who's got challenging approval ratings. Any incumbent in today's world only survives if they turn it into a searing choice, not a referendum on that, no matter what's going on. And I think that's what he has to do. And in a way, Vance helps because I think he is going to be down the line, not just supportive of Trump's policies, but he's talked about overturning the Constitution. And so I think that at the end of the day, Biden should be able to take advantage of that.
David Plouffe, thank you so much. Mark Short, thanks to you as well. We've got a lot more news to get to, including some breaking news coming into us in literally just the last maybe 90 seconds or so. And that is this. The Justice Department, according to a special counsel spokesperson, has authorized the special counsel to appeal that stunning court order by Judge Cannon, who was appointed by Mr. Trump, that essentially threw out the entire classified documents case against the former president. The judge saying that because Jack Smith was named by the Department of Justice and not President Biden himself, his appointment violates the Constitution. We thought from the jump, as soon as we learned about this, that there would be an appeal lodged. Now we know that that appears to be where it's headed, with that confirmation now from that special counsel spokesperson. We're going to have more on that coming up right after this quick break. But before that, too, I'm looking at Vivek Ramaswamy, who is joining us here on set. We're going to have him in just a second. Don't go anywhere, as we are live from Milwaukee, the first day of the Republican National Convention. Our special coverage continues on NBC News Now in just a sec. We are back live from Milwaukee, joined now by former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, who is here with us on set. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you.
So big news of the day, obviously, is the nomination of somebody who you know pretty well, your former law school classmate, Ohio Senator JD Vance. Your reaction?
That's right. I have a different dimension of knowing JD for a long time out of politics. We used to watch Cincinnati Bengals games back in law school in New Haven bars. We didn't even talk politics back then. But what I can say is he's a genuine person. He is somebody who actually cares about this country. He's in public service for the right reasons. We grew up not that far from each other, even in Southwest Ohio. And I can say one of the things about my relationship with him is we've agreed on most things, but even when we disagree, we push each other a little bit. And that's so missing in our American politics today, is original thinkers who are energetic, who are intelligent, who care about the country. He's been one of the most successful senators, in my opinion. He's probably been our strongest fighter in the Senate. And I think he's going to make for an outstanding vice president. I truly believe that.
Your name at one point had been floated on that, let's call it, long list for vice president. I think even when you were running for president, you fielded that question quite a bit, whether you would serve as VP. We now know who the pick will be. Politically, from that perspective, there has been some talk that maybe somebody like a Marco Rubio could serve the former president better as it relates to pulling in voters who may not have otherwise gone for him. How does JD Vance help the ticket?
So I don't really view it necessarily that way. A lot of an analysis, or what you say, pundits would check the box on what ethnicity or whatever. I think you look at it more in a bigger way, that JD brings a lot of intangibles to the table. He's an American dream story. That speaks to me, but it speaks to a lot of other people like me in the country. I'm the kid of legal immigrants who came here, my parents did, with no money. I've lived the American dream. JD was born in humble circumstances. He's lived the American dream as well. His wife, Usha, is somebody who's a friend of our family as well. She was also a law school classmate. I think she could be a big attribute in this campaign in reaching non-traditional voters. And even further for JD himself, he is somebody who has a unique vantage point for bringing in new voters. Here's what it is. He wasn't somebody who was a Donald Trump evangelist back in 2016.
So I think that's actually
it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, well, I acknowledge that. But what I would say is he can actually reach a lot of other people who also weren't in the Donald Trump camp in 2016. And in a very personal and authentic way, he can say, look, here's why I moved. And here's why I want you to come with us as well.
So
I think that's unique.
You're saying that you think his evolution on the former president could actually be relatable to some independents?
Yes, I think it could actually be an attribute to bringing independents and even some Democrats in. A lot of working class Democrats, a lot of union members across the country. Trump is already strong with a lot of those audiences, but JD, I think, plays even further to those strengths. And I think there's a good chance this Trump-Vance ticket could be the most formidable presidential ticket, certainly in my lifetime. And I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing them succeed at a big scale in saving the country.
If they do succeed in November, it would obviously open up a Senate seat in Ohio. Would you consider it?
I haven't gotten that question today at all, actually. No, the reality is it's hot off the press. To be frank, I would strongly consider it if I were asked to serve, but I would also want to have a serious conversation with President Trump about the other ways I could have an impact on the country. My top passion is taking on the regulatory state. I think that's a nonpartisan issue that's actually impeding our economy, in some ways even threatens the American model of self-governance. I think that administrative state is far too big. There are ways to address that from the executive branch. There are also things that need to be done from Congress and the Senate, too. So I look forward to those conversations after President Trump is successfully reelected with JD Vance.
I'll ask because I've got to check the box. Has anybody reached out to you from Governor DeWine's office to broach this issue yet?
I have not discussed this with Governor DeWine.
Anybody from his office?
I haven't discussed it with President DeWine. I haven't discussed it with Governor DeWine. But I look forward to evaluating what the future holds in store. I would strongly consider it if asked, but I think there are a lot of other ways to serve this country. And this isn't about what comes after victory. This is about what our path is to victory in November.
To that point, and then I'll move on, but I want to ask you, talk about the ways that you think you can serve former President Trump. Chief of Staff in the White House, is that something that has been brought up to you as a possible role?
We've talked about a lot of different possibilities
Who's
from the cabinet. President Trump and I have had, we talk regularly. I spoke to him, actually most recently, it was after midnight on the night that he suffered that injury, that tragedy, and the assassination attempt on Saturday night. One of the things I admire about him is he's always strong, he's always energetic. And I think we get along, and we want to save the country together. But that's going to come in a lot of different forms. So we've talked about different ideas potentially in a cabinet to other ways of driving change. And, today I think adds one more development that'll give us a lot to consider.
Let's go back to that conversation that you had with the former president after that assassination attempt against him in Butler, Pennsylvania at that rally on Saturday. Can you give us some insight? We have seen a couple of print interviews that are new out today that he conducted with a couple of folks who were on the plane as he flew to Milwaukee. Give us some insight into his thinking, into his state of mind at this critical moment.
I think his headspace is exactly where it needs to be, to lead this country, not lead the Republican Party, but to lead the United States of America. Joe Biden did pledge to unite the country. I think it's fair to say that had he succeeded in that, we wouldn't be where we are right now. But I think what we're going to see from Donald Trump in a second term, and even for the remainder of this race, is something far beyond even what we saw in that first term. Success is unifying. Excellence is unifying. And I think Donald Trump is actually going to be the president who will unite this country. And I know that sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people, especially to perhaps this audience. But the reality is unity is not just going to come through words. I think unity will come through action. I think his focus on the economy, his focus on illegal immigration, that unites a lot of different Americans. And the good news is Saturday, what happened was a near tragedy. But if there's one silver lining that comes out of it, and I hope that some silver lining can come out of that tragedy, it can be that all Americans reject this idea of not just political violence, but the idea that you can disagree with somebody vigorously, but still not view them as your enemy, still indeed respect them as a fellow citizen. And do both parties need to do better on that? Absolutely. But I think one of the things we in the Republican Party can do is focus on our own agenda rather than just villainizing the other side.
To your point, though, on this turn to unity, if you will, on this pivot to unity, if you will, setting aside whether or not it's surprising, that's not for me to say, looking at past history, looking at whether past is precedent. I've covered the former president, as you know, for many years, and was told fairly regularly during his time in the White House that there would be a unifying moment ahead, and then that rarely materialized with a person in office who was, as we know, Donald Trump to be, defiant, as he is in the face of this, as you call it, near tragedy, this assassination attempt against him. So, yes, he's talking about ripping up his convention speech and rewriting it to make it more unifying, but then posting online on Truth Social in ways that sound a lot like, Friday Donald Trump. How do you see that playing out?
So I don't think this is going to be a fake, artificial, short-term national unity, because that won't last anyway. This is not a kumbaya, let's use flowery words and hold hands. I think it's going to be deeper than that. I think it's going to be a national unity that comes from the fact that you may not agree with everything Donald Trump says, but you will still know that he will defend to the death your right to say it. And I think that's a different message. That's what I miss. That's the America that I think many of us in this country miss, where we can get together at the dinner table, we can disagree vehemently, but still view an ideology as the enemy, not our fellow neighbor, not our fellow citizen. And can both parties do a better job of that? Absolutely. Do we have an opportunity to do it this convention? I think we do. I'll be speaking tomorrow night. President Trump's on Thursday night. And I hope that's what Americans take away from seeing a different type and a different side of Donald Trump that I know he cares about national unity, but I hope more Americans are able to see it.
Very quickly, do you anticipate we may see him even tonight?
I hope so. I think the more we see of him, the better. He's a man of the people, and the more we break the normal convention norms, I think the better off it'll be.
Vivek Ramaswamy, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Making some news there. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're going to be right back with more coverage from here in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. See you in a sec. I'm Hallie Jackson, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee as our special coverage of the first night of the Republican National Convention continues here. You are looking at Senator JD Vance, the Ohio freshman, walking in within just the last hour or so, set to receive that nomination officially as Donald Trump's running mate. That happened in a moment that saw an ovation for what is now the Trump-Vance ticket formally and officially. No longer the presumptive nominees. They are the party's pick for the White House come November. The question now, how does this campaign play out, and how does this convention play out over the course of the next week? Just 48 hours removed now from that assassination attempt against former President Trump at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. We have got our entire team here live on the ground covering every angle, including our moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, our chief political correspondent, Chuck Todd, our senior national correspondent, Tom Yamas, all with us here. And this is going to be the posture for the next week as we are watching so much news being made and history being made as well. Kristen, we have not seen, obviously we talked about the backdrop of what happened Saturday leading to this moment now, the vice presidential pick. We haven't seen a vice presidential pick rolled out on the floor of the convention in 4 decades like this.
It was so significant, and it quite frankly was a moment of jubilation here in the convention hall, a very different tone, of course, than the somber events that we've been tracking over the past several days, Hallie. And this is a pick that we were anticipating, but it is still extremely significant because some within the party think it's a little risky. JD Vance, 39 years old, in his second year of being a U.S. senator. This is a generational pick, someone who is a nod to the next generation. There are questions about whether he really helps with the electoral map. A lot of people say Marco Rubio would have done more to help Donald Trump in that regard. But look, this is someone who is viewed as the future of the MAGA movement. You talk about the apprentice. This is a sign that Donald Trump is quite literally bringing an apprentice with him of sorts if he does, in fact, become president. Again, someone who will carry that torch of the MAGA movement, someone who has an isolationist foreign policy, someone who's a former Trump critic,
that's right,
by the way, Hallie, and now one of his fiercest defenders.
To that point, Kristen, and bringing Chuck and Tom into the conversation, I was just chatting with Vivek Ramaswamy, and he suggested that perhaps the way that JD Vance has evolved on Donald Trump could actually be potentially relatable to some people in America, some of those small slice of independent voters who perhaps feel the same way that JD Vance did 8-10 years ago.
It's an interesting theory if he leans into it, right? I just don't know.
It's hard to think about JD Vance, given everything he said publicly about former President Trump in the last couple of years, coming out and reminding people of the things he said previously.
Right. Instead, I believe he said he wished the president had amnesia and didn't remember what he had to say in 2016. Look, I go back to, this is such an important message that Donald Trump has sent the rest of the Republican Party. There is no more, he is the establishment. MAGA is the establishment now. There is no more free market conservative wing of the party. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It's here. There are people here that represent it. But think about where we are, the home state of Paul Ryan. This, in theory, would have been Paul Ryan's convention had Mitt Romney been elected, and we might be sitting here, and Paul Ryan
on Earth 6,
right, on Earth 6 or 7. The point is, wow, has the Republican Party, when you think about where they were in 2012, Donald Trump comes in 2016, and within 8 years, he is just totally marginalize the business wing of the party. I mean, this is a much different. The message he's sending is that this is not an electoral map thing. This is a more of like, this is who the party is now. This is my party, and the people I'm going to pick are the ones that can best articulate my vision. And that's what he sees in JD Vance. Someone said to me, he's a spokesperson, almost the way Pete Buttigieg has served as a spokesperson for Joe Biden as sort of the next generation in the cabinet. That's what Vance is going to be. And I think what Trump likes about Vance is that I think the Yale law degree brings an intellectual heft in his mind to Trumpism. Now, some people will say there really isn't an intellectual through line to Trumpism. It's just a series of Trump's ids or whatever he thinks it is. But in some ways, JD Vance has given, he's a better defender sometimes of Trump's policies than Trump himself is.
And yet, pulling back for a second, Tom, the word that keeps coming up for me sitting here is incongruous. Because here we are. At this table, we've probably covered, I don't know, dozens of conventions at this point. Oh. Chuck, you're behind many of those. And they're always intended to be, whichever side of the aisle you're on, a pretty good time. It's meant to be a party. It's meant to be a celebration of the official nominee, if you will, and of the official ticket. But here, what has permeated so much of the discussion, you hear it from delegates, you hear it from lawmakers and politicians that we've all been talking to, is the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. We have not heard from him on camera publicly in a formal way since that happened on Saturday night, Tom, and there is a sense of change here at this moment.
Yeah, and I was talking about this, right? It was so weird to walk into this convention hall and everybody was smiling. There was energy, there was excitement, the red hats, the red jackets. I just left Butler, Pennsylvania, where people were sad, they were depressed, they were confused. They didn't understand what just had happened, and they were so disappointed that someone from their community had perpetrated this horrific crime. It's strange being here. At the same time, we talk about voters and who's going to turn out, right? And the president himself has talked about this now in interviews, that the image of him with his fist raised post-assassination attempt, he called it himself iconic. We're going to have to wait and see. But that no doubt has rallied a lot of Republicans around him. Now with the pick of JD Vance, it's funny, I'm kind of reliving 2016 again in my head. People are like, oh, maybe he'll pick a moderate. Maybe he'll pick Governor Chris Christie. You know, oh, he's going to try to gain more viewers. He leaned into Mike Pence at the time, who was even more conservative than he was.
Sure, but it did help shore up his conservative evangelical.
Some conservatives, but he went more conservative. He didn't try to get the center of the party. And with JD Vance, it's the same play. He's almost, I don't want to say he's doubling down on the MAGA movement, but he sort of is. Is he going to drive out more people in the rural communities, which we've talked about in Top Story all the time? He's going to bring those people out. And I made the larger point that I wonder if he made the calculation. If you looked at the electorate and he said, I'm actually doing great with minority voters, much better than I was doing in 2016 and 2020. Maybe Senator Marco Rubio doesn't push me over the edge, but maybe JD Vance gets me voters who weren't going to come out. I know it may sound strange because people love people who vote for Donald Trump. They love him. They show up to those rallies, thousands deep. But maybe he gets voters that aren't part of the process now, that are going to double down, who saw all the events that happened on Saturday, are upset, and are going to make their voices heard in November.
When we look at this, and I want our team to roll some of that video of JD Vance receiving the nomination officially, because it was clearly an emotional moment for somebody who is, listen, 39 years old. Talk about next generation. At least that is what he hopes, and what Donald Trump Jr., who, as we all know, and I'm told, has been advocating both publicly and privately for JD Vance. Kristen, the Biden campaign is also preparing for what is now the Trump-Vance ticket. Talk us through how that dynamic plays out.
Well, they've already come out and said they're going to paint him as being extreme. And there are a range of different ways in which they are going to do that. They will likely note that he was out front when it came to arguing against more aid to Ukraine. He has also been someone who has been to the right of Donald Trump on the issue of abortion, someone who, when he was asked about the Texas abortion law, he said of that law that does not include exceptions for rape and incest, that pregnancy in those instances would be, quote unquote, inconvenient. And that is just not where Trump is on that issue. He's been, of course, very clear that it's a states' rights issue from his perspective. He's also told his party that this is an issue that could cost them votes. So you can bet that the Biden campaign is going to focus on some of that past rhetoric from JD Vance as it relates to issues like abortion and other matters, to try to make the case that he is, quote unquote, extreme.
Look, it's important to note, and we all, I think, have similar sourcing on this, that there were a lot of people in the Trump campaign advocating against Vance. not because they worried that he would serve as a, you sort of look at it this way. A friend of mine always likes to say, in football, when the opponent goes for it on fourth down, are you happy or sad? And if you're always terrified when the team you're playing goes for it because you're like, oh no, I wanted him to punt and give me the ball. The Biden campaign really was rooting for Vance. That's who they wanted. They didn't want Rubio and they didn't want Burgum. They thought neither one of them did anything for them. But they see Vance as an opportunity to bring in what they think are more radical parts of Project 2025 and that whole thing. And that's what they want to do. And then at the same time, distract Trump a lot with all these old clips of Vance saying he's unfit to serve and all of that. A TV ad that I'm sure we're going to see air probably before the week's over.
We've probably had 3,000 conversations about the moment that former President Trump has changed, he has evolved. But I do want to point out a couple things. Since the debate, he has taken a step back. He has been able to, quote unquote, control himself, let Biden step over his own news. He hasn't gotten in the way. He had this apprentice VP pick game play out the way he wanted it. He didn't tweet it out. He didn't lose control. He almost got killed on Saturday. Still didn't say anything. Came here on Monday. The plan, I don't know if it worked, but this was just a plan, and it was executed.
Well, Tom, Chuck, Kristen, I want to say thanks to all of you. I have to excuse myself momentarily. Kristen and I are going to be right back. We're going to turn it over to your capable hands for more coverage coming up as we now continue, of course, with all of this significant news happening here in Milwaukee.
And I'll pick it up, Hallie. Thank you for that. As we've been reporting, Senator JD Vance, of course, from Ohio, now former President Trump, now former President Trump's running mate. Here at the RNC, it's officially the Trump-Vance ticket. So who exactly is JD Vance? Gabe Gutierrez has more.
He is the junior senator from Ohio with only 2 years in government. But JD Vance is one of former President Trump's biggest defenders.
I want to help Donald Trump get elected because it's really important that he become the next president.
In the Senate,
how can we defend Ukraine's borders when we're not even defending our own American border?
And on the campaign trail.
The question is, are we going to send America First fighters to Washington, D.C.?
He's one of the leading voices of Trump's MAGA America First movement, not holding back and pushing the former president's agenda.
Republicans, we need to govern like we won the majority the American people gave us, not like a bunch of cowards.
But that hasn't always been the case. This was Vance in 2016.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
He was deeply critical of Trump then, but here's Vance just 6 years later.
The president is right. I wasn't always nice, but the simple fact is he's the best president of my lifetime, and he revealed the corruption in this country like nobody else.
Running for Senate in 2022 in Ohio as an extremely pro-Trump candidate.
I was wrong about Donald Trump. I didn't think he was going to be a good president, Brett. He was a great president.
Vance shot to fame as the author of Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir about his upbringing in a poor, hard-hit part of Ohio. He then enlisted in the Marines, went to Yale Law School, into venture capital, and then to the Senate, his first role in government. On the major issues, Vance has said he would support a national ban on abortion after 15 weeks, but is for exceptions, including for rape and the life of the mother. On immigration, Vance has called for finishing Trump's southern border wall. And on the issue of the 2020 presidential election, then Senate candidate Vance suggested he would have supported fraudulent slates of pro-Trump electors.
If I had been vice president, I would have told the states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and so many others that we needed to have multiple slates of electors, and I think the U.S. Congress should have fought over it from there. That is
now the father of two, just 39 years old, after not even a full 2 years in government, is set to step onto the biggest political stage in the world.
All right, we thank Gabe for that report. Chuck Todd, our chief political analyst, is back with me. Chuck, this was a couple decades ago, maybe when you got into politics, maybe when I started as an embed, we would call Senator J.D. Vance a political neophyte. Yeah. But that doesn't really matter anymore, right? A political neophyte became the head of the Republican Party, became the president. What is he up against, and what will he learn, do you think, over the next few months?
Well, I think, look, we talk about vetting, right? What this magical word vetting. And what it is really, they're going to go, everybody's going to go through his life. We all are. You're going to go through parts, you're going to find out stuff about yourself as the running mate that you didn't know. Yeah. And when you have somebody, this was the advantage of Doug Burgum and Marco Rubio. They'd run for president before. You knew what the flaws were. There wasn't going to be any surprises. Now, the campaign is supposed to do all these things and make sure that there's no surprises. But being new on the scene, the last time we had a candidate with with this little political electoral experience was Sarah Palin. And we saw there was initial interest. So the good news is there's initial interest. Who is this guy? Who is this woman? But there's a race to define them. And that's what you're going to see here, a race by Democrats to define them. Republicans are going to want to define them a certain way. Look, with Palin, I would argue on balance, it hurt McCain. It didn't help him. Paul Ryan was, I think, a negative for Mitt Romney, because what did Democrats do? They took Ryan's plans on Medicare and made him own it. And that's going to be what Democrats try to do with JD Vance, JD Vance was a bit more of a blunt speaker. You know, he is, you heard it in Gabe's piece. I think they can sort of make hay out of it. I do want to always press pause on these conversations, though. The most humiliating vice presidential debate that I ever witnessed was what Lloyd Benson did to Dan Quayle.
Right.
And it didn't matter one iota. Dan Quayle was not seen as qualified to be president. Voters didn't think he should be vice president, and it didn't matter at all. George H.W. Bush won. It's the largest landslide we've had, most recent landslide we've had.
You know, I do want to ask you, remind our viewers, will America even get a vice presidential debate?
It's an interesting question.
If Kamala Harris is still if she's still there, when I say still there, she might be the actual nominee.
Yeah.
But if she's still the running mate, the vice president, will she go up against Senator JD Vance?
And that's a great question, because I think right now, you know, I don't think this Biden question is done. I think the Biden question is still a real question, and there's obviously, I guess there's a debate scheduled for the end of this month, maybe
September,
one in August, perhaps. I think that's a fair question. I wouldn't bet on it, but I think it's less likely J.D. Vance debates Kamala Harris and more likely Donald Trump debates Kamala Harris.
That could be. I did want to ask you about that. It's interesting. Because of all the news that's happened, I don't want to say we've forgotten, because we haven't. I know Democrats haven't forgotten. But we were in this news cycle of, is President Biden going to be the nominee?
Right.
The horrific events of Saturday happened, and that's been put on the back burner. I was reminding Kristen and Hallie that the reason why Biden did that interview with Lester Holt today is to reassure voters and reassure America he's still all there. Is that test still happening?
Oh, I think it is, 100%. And look, it's beyond that. There's a lot of Democratic campaigns that are polling Kamala Harris right now. You have people inside the Biden-Harris ticket that are looking at Harris at the top of the ticket. Who does she bring? Look, they're seeing some stuff that we saw. And there's a debate right now. Does she help House candidates, right? If you're a House Democrat and you're hoping to win the House, what may be better for a presidential may not be the same as what's better for the House candidate. If she helps get some base turnout, more African-American voters to the Democratic ticket, even in losing, some House Democrats might prefer to lose with Harris than lose with Biden.
I know you've done a lot of reporting on this. Have the questions, the rumors, the innuendos that there might be another Democratic nominee, it might not be her, has that sort of...
It's almost dead, because logistically, forget the fight that this could happen, just logistically, if Democrats... They've become an oddly pragmatic party. This is, when they want to be orderly about this, and everything I hear, it's like, if this happens, they're hoping to do it before the convention. They don't want the convention to be where this takes place. They want the convention to be where they showcase
a public fight where there might be.
Exactly. They'd like to use the convention to showcase the new ticket if there is one.
We have a clip. This is President Biden speaking with our Lester Holt earlier today. Let's take a look.
Well, let's talk about the conversation this has started, and it's really about language, what we say out loud, and the consequences of those. You called your opponent an existential threat on a call a week ago. You said it's time to put Trump in the bullseye. There's some dispute about the context, but I think you appreciate that
I didn't say
words
crosshairs. I was talking about focus on. Look, the truth of the matter was, what I guess I was talking about at the time was, there was very little focus on Trump's agenda.
Yeah, the term is bullseye.
It was a mistake to use the word. I didn't say crosshairs. I meant bullseye. I meant focus on him. Focus on what he's doing. Focus on his policies. Focus on the number of lies he told in the debate. Focus. I mean, there's a whole range of things that, look, I'm not the guy that said, I want to be a dictator on day one. I'm not the guy that refused to accept the outcome of the election. I'm not the guy who said that wouldn't accept the outcome of this election automatically. You can't only love your country when you win. And so the focus was on what he's saying, and I mean, the idea.
But have you taken a step back and done a little soul searching on things that you may have said that could incite people who are not balanced?
Well, I don't think, look, how do you talk about the threat to democracy, which is real, when a president says things like he says? Do you just not say anything because it may incite somebody? Look, I have not engaged in that rhetoric. Now, my opponent is engaged in that rhetoric. He talks about there'll be a bloodbath if he loses, talking about how he's going to forgive all the, actually, I guess, suspend the sentences of all those who were arrested and sentenced to go to jail because of what happened in the Capitol. I'm not out there making fun of, like, remember the picture of Donald Trump when Nancy Pelosi's husband was hit with a hammer, joking about it.
And White House correspondent Ali Rafa is going to join us now with more on that interview. Ali, you know, once these interviews come out, good press teams, good political teams are quick to call people like you and start the spinning and say, he was great, he was strong. Are you already getting that? What is the Biden-Harris re-elect team saying so far about the interview, if anything?
Well, it's interesting, Tom, because you heard the president admit that it was a, quote, mistake to make that a bullseye comment at that fundraiser recently and telling donors that he said that he meant it in the context of refocusing the Democratic Party on Trump. But what's interesting about this is that the press secretary was asked during today's White House press briefing whether in the wake of that monumental Oval Office address that the president delivered last night, whether he regrets any of the rhetoric he has used, not just against former President Trump, but other rivals in the 2024 race, whether the messaging, the tone of his campaign will change moving forward in the wake of that address, and the president trying to tamp down this heated rhetoric, trying to condemn this violence in this rhetoric. And she simply said that this is not the time to politicize this moment. She said that the president is going to continue drawing a contrast between what he has done the last 3.5 years versus what they say a backwards focused second Trump administration would focus on. And she repeated multiple times the president's desire to tamp down this rhetoric in the country right now. And so this is going to continue being this very difficult balancing act for the Biden campaign, for the president, because remember, the president has said multiple times that it was the Charlottesville riots that inspired him and motivated him to run in 2020. He has repeatedly used the January 6th attack on the Capitol as sort of the theme and the mood of his administration. And so this is a very delicate dance that they're doing, trying to figure out how hard and how sharply to hit former President Trump and his campaign, while also staying above the fray as commander-in-chief and not now the two-time rival of former President Trump, and not to appear hypocritical in the wake of that Oval Office address, in the wake of this assassination attempt on former President Trump, as the president continues to stress this need for unity in this country.
Ali Rafa for us. Ali, we appreciate all your reporting. We thank you for that. I'm looking out on the convention floor. I'm trying to find our NBC correspondent, Garrett Hake. He's a tall drink of water, but I can't seem to see where he is right now. I heard he was down there. Wait, I see him now. Wait, he's in the booth. Is that him? Garrett, can you hear me?
Yeah, Tom, I am across, basically next to the stage in a position just off stage. I'll be watching the speakers tonight from about a 90-degree angle from their backs above the floor, able to keep an eye out not just on the speakers but on the delegates themselves and see how they're reacting to what's going to be a pretty diverse cross-section, if you will, of the Republican Party tonight. Anytime you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene in the undercard and Glenn Youngkin in prime time, you're really seeing a pretty wide swath of Republicans. And I suppose that's the point here on night one with all the news happening in the early part of the day.
You know, Garrett, I was in that same position in 2016, and I'll never forget when Senator Ted Cruz came out and he delivered this speech, and essentially at the end didn't give his endorsement to former President Trump. He said, vote your conscience, and then everyone started to boo him. And I called it his Stone Cold Steve Austin movie, walked off the stage. Do we expect any drama at this convention?
That was a major heel turn moment, and those of us reading ahead of Ted Cruz, knowing it was coming, could feel the tension build in the room. I don't know that we're going to see anything like that. I mean, the difference between that convention and this one is we're really in a situation now where Donald Trump is in complete control, not just of this convention, but of this Republican Party. The pick of JD Vance today obviously cements that. It makes it even more clear. But there's no more Republican resistance to Donald Trump in any meaningful way. I mean, I saw Asa Hutchinson, who ran against Trump and basically, described him as a threat to the country in much the same terms as most Democrats, posing for selfies in the hallway here. Obviously, Tom, he won't be speaking tonight. Nikki Haley, probably the closest thing to a remaining Trump critic, who is expected to speak tomorrow, I believe, may come slightly closer to that, but I have a hard time imagining the Trump team would let her within a few miles of this building without complete oversight of her script. I think really perhaps the closest we're going to see to anything like that has already happened on the floor. That's when Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, was on the floor to deliver Kentucky's delegate votes to Donald Trump. He was lustily booed by a crowd here who has distanced themselves from him on everything from the response to January 6th to especially his foreign policy, a much more kind of old school Republican Reagan-like foreign policy than anything espoused by Donald Trump or his new running mate, JD Vance.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Nikki Haley. I won't be surprised if we hear a little bit of booing, maybe some murmurs. You never know, though, right? She still had 20% of the electorate, the Republican electorate, who was still backing her even after she dropped out of the race in certain states. Garrett, before you go, what was the talk to me about sort of the vibe check when the news broke that it was Senator JD Vance? Were people excited? Were they excited once he walked in? Can you get a sense if he sort of electrified the ticket, or are people like, meh, we'll take him?
Well, look, there was a definite buzz in the room, in part because of the manner in which the news broke. With Donald Trump posting it on social media, you could hear just kind of word of mouth from people handing their phones to the folks next to them, starting to talk about the idea that it would be Vance. I think a lot of folks had expected that outcome, or at least folks in this room had hoped for it. I mean, remember, Vance is a new face to much of the world politically, but very much a known commodity in the MAGA movement, the American First movement. This is somebody who is a true believer, like these delegates. I think by the time he came onto the floor, that energy had built up considerably. He got a very warm welcome, as I'm sure he will when he accepts the nomination on Wednesday night. But I think it's important to remember, JD Vance's job is not to win over the people in this room. It's going to be to reach voters who perhaps might not have the same appeal, might not find the same appeal from Donald Trump, or get those kind of wavering folks to actually turn out and vote. That's a different mission than getting this room amped up.
Garrett Hake, hope you have a lot of coffee. I know you're going to be a busy guy all week. We appreciate all your reporting. A stunning ruling today and a huge legal win for former President Trump, with a federal judge throwing out the entire classified documents case, saying the appointment of the special counsel who brought the case was unconstitutional. Judge Eileen Cannon, who was appointed by Mr. Trump, says that because Jack Smith was named by the DOJ and not the president, his appointment violates the Constitution. Attorney General Merrick Garland will likely appeal this decision, but today's ruling all but guarantees that there won't be a trial on classified documents until after the November election. Danny Savalos, one of our legal eagles, joins us now. Danny, I do want to ask you about this. Does the judge have a point, or did this come out of nowhere?
It didn't come out of nowhere. This argument's been made for many months now, and it's been tossed around in different circles. Even the opinion itself today cites a law review article, an academic article that's been arguing for some time now that even special counsel Mueller's appointment was unlawful, or unconstitutional, I should say. And the argument basically is that the appointments clause of the Constitution has certain requirements, and those were not met here. For example, when a U.S. attorney is appointed, the president nominates and the Senate gives its advice and consent. Similar process for Supreme Court justices and all federal judges. The challenge here is that the special counsel didn't fall within any of the statutory grants of authority for the special counsel. At least that's what Judge Cannon concluded. Even though this issue has been taken up by other courts that do not have precedential or controlling authority over this particular court in Florida, other courts have reached different results, which really signals that this case, if and when it's appealed, is probably heading towards the high court.
Do we know a timeline on that? We just said this likely is not going to be decided before the election, but do we know how far down the road this legal can be kicked?
It is the eternal question with all things appeals in federal court and state court, which is how long will this take? And the answer is it is completely dependent upon the courthouse, the judge's practices, and the particular case. And in this case, Judge Cannon has moved relatively slowly compared to other federal court judges. And so the appeals process could take as long or as quickly as the appeals court handles it.
Danny Savalos, we appreciate you as always. We thank you for all your help on this and explaining this case, which was such stunning breaking news because of all the legal trouble the former president has faced, especially so close to Election Day. Danny, we always thank you for joining us. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of you throughout the week talking about these things, and we will be right back. And welcome to our special coverage at the Republican National Convention. I'm Tom Llamas. We want to get right to NBC's Dasha Burns, who is here in Milwaukee. She joins me live outside the convention center right now. You know, Dasha, it is strange. You and I were just in Pennsylvania, in Butler, Pennsylvania, and the mood here is so much different. People obviously not forgetting what happened there, but sort of trying to rejoice here and trying to celebrate. Yeah. The nominee and now the ticket, essentially, right? President Trump and his former President Trump and his running mate, Senator JD Vance. I know you were part of our reporting team when we were trying to nail down exactly who Trump was going to pick. Talk to me from your conversations inside Trump world and the Republican Party. How did the president get to JD Vance?
Yeah, Tom, just to touch on your point about the juxtaposition between what we experienced over the weekend and today, you know, I asked some of the delegates on the floor about that, and it seemed like they were taking the lead from their party leader, from former President Trump, who, as you know, that iconic photo of him with the fist in the air saying fight, fight, fight in the aftermath. They feel like they, too, want to project strength, and celebration in this case is a way to do that. The senator from Ohio, JD Vance, of course, he was on that list that we've talked about many times now. JD Vance, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. There were pros and cons for all of them. There were different factions of Trump world pushing for each one of them. Doug Burgum was largely viewed as the more safe choice, the person who would not overshadow former President Trump, who would be loyal. Florida Senator Marco Rubio was viewed as somebody. I'll send it back to you, Tom. I know we have some news.
All right, Dasha Burns, we appreciate all your reporting. We're going to hear from you a lot over the next few hours. I want to bring it, and to be completely transparent here, we're obviously in a very fluid situation. Now, as you look at the video of Senator JD Vance when he entered the convention hall right there to cheers, we have our good friend Jacob Soboroff, who's down, I understand, on the convention floor, I think, right now, with Kevin McCarthy, if that's correct, Jacob?
Yeah, Tom, that's right. I'm here with former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Let's go around this way, and we'll get a chance to say hello to him as soon as he's wrapping up his interview. He just walked in here to the convention floor, and you guys know how it is. All of a sudden, there's a crush of people. I'm going to let you listen in a little bit to what he's saying right now, but then we'll grab him as soon as he's wrapped up.
An open border with inflation going forward. I mean, people really want to look to not only just have a strong leader, but someone that will represent them, someone they'll fight for them. And I think when you look at the Trump-Vance ticket, it's much stronger than what we've had right now.
And have you spoken to the former president since that incident on Sunday?
Yeah, I talked to him yesterday. And in talking to the president, he was telling me about even literally hearing the bullet by his ear and going through. And the president was still being the president, even though it was a life-threatening. And knowing that he was so just a small movement, he wouldn't be alive today. And his first concerns was about the individual who had got killed that day and those who got wounded. But then he was still the president explaining to me that he learned from the doctor that there's a lot of blood in your ear. And you don't really know that. I didn't know that before. Then he would say, now, Kevin, you'll learn because you have big, beautiful ears, right? So you'll learn that one day. But no, he was still looking through there. And really what you're hearing from him, the word unite, he's really taking this moment in stride, understanding what it meant, right? He didn't run from it. He stood up to fight for the American public, and he wants to unite all Americans.
Speaker, we're live also on NBC right now. Can I ask you quickly, we've heard a lot about change. The former president's posture is going to change in the wake of this assassination attempt. What do you think that change is going to look like?
I think with the president, I don't take it as a change. I think it's always an improvement, right? You learn from your experience. Think about if someone, a life-threatening experience like that, and someone actually lost their life there. He understands the value of it, and he picked himself up. Where here's a sick person comes in, tries to destroy America and democracy itself, that he's willing to fight for it. I think the thing you're hearing from the president, too, is also learning from tone, right? How can I bring more people in and unite them from this experience at the same time? And I think those are the things you'll hear from him.
You use the word tone. Do you think there'll be a policy shift in any way, in any type of policy? Obviously, immigration policy was very divisive during the administration. We've heard a lot about abortion during this campaign. Is there going to be any type of policy shift in order to unify the country? Or is it, what did he say about what that means to him?
I don't see how the president has to change his policies to unite. I mean, the president wouldn't be leading right now, and the current President Biden wouldn't be such low approval rating if his policies were wanted. I mean, I think this is really good and healthy for America to have a debate on policy. Do you want your border wide open, or do you want a secure border? Do you want to curb inflation, or do you want inflation to still be rampant? Do you like the idea that Putin has invaded other countries, but the only time he didn't invade anywhere is when President Trump was in? Do you like the idea that you had 5 embassies that had to be evacuated under Biden, and you didn't under Trump? Did you like the idea that North Korea is testing missiles again, but they didn't under President Trump? So I think that debate of policies was really what the country's looking for, and less about personality.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Mr. Speaker, thanks very much. Tom, I'm going to send it back to you, former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy.
Jacob Silveroff, we appreciate you. We thank you for that. I'm joined now live by Wall Street Journal senior political correspondent Molly Ball and Mark Short, former chief of staff to Mike Pence, also an NBC News contributor. Thank you both for being here. Molly, I'm going to start with you. You just finished a lengthy profile on Senator JD Vance, now on the ticket with former President Trump. What did you learn?
Well, Senator Vance, in his very short time in elected politics, less than 2 years, has really become the sort of chief ideologue and propagandist for this new populist conservatism that represents the way that Trump has reshaped the party. It's a type of conservative philosophy that is much less about the sort of small government and fiscal responsibility and internationalist perspective of the old Republican Party. I think we can see with him being picked that, you know, Trump's takeover of the party is complete, and he's picked someone who is philosophically very much in his image, someone who sees potentially a muscular role for the state in the economy, who supports things like tariffs, and who went even further than Trump to oppose aid to Ukraine when it was up for debate in the Senate.
Mark, you were there for the process with former Vice President Mike Pence. Is this a good choice, and why do you think Donald Trump picked J.D. Vance?
I think J.D. Vance offers a rags to riches story. He's somebody who comes from Appalachia. I think people are familiar with that part of his life. A Marine who served our country. I think he is, in effect, the strongest surrogate for Trump's policies, as Molly was saying. I don't know what it really does politically, but I also don't know that it would have mattered in this case. I think you have two well-known...
You don't think he brings in any more votes in any of those states, the blue wall states, the Michigan, the Wisconsin, the states that decide the election?
Trump already has.
You think he already has them? You don't think there's any more reinvigorating of those voters?
No, I think that he's looking for a surrogate, and I think in many ways he's got his best surrogate on these issues. I think, as Molly says, it's a stark contrast to where the party is today. I don't accept the populist conservatism. I think that's an oxymoron. I think it's fully populist at this point. And I think when you go through the positions that J.D. Vance has spearheaded for the president on significant tariffs, on basically, as you said, we had a deregulatory agenda. J.D. Vance has praised Biden's regulatory agenda in many cases. And I think you look, as you said, on Ukraine. I mean, Kevin's just talking about the lack of attack from Russian aggression, but J.D. Vance is the one who's most anxious to just give up the territory that Russia's already taken.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting debate if it happens. See what happens. Molly, we thank you. Mark, we thank you as well. We're going to take a quick break. Stay right with us.
You've spoken with him. Give us a sense into his mindset.
I think like anybody, if you came that close to losing your life, you reflect on that. His first reflection was the man who lost his life and those who got injured that day. But he would tell me about literally hearing the bullet, the sound ripping into the ear, and then he was still Trump being Trump, saying, you know, I learned there's a lot of blood in the end. Now, Kevin, you have big, beautiful ears. You'd really bleed, you know. But But the one thing, it resonates, you hear the word unite more. I think he's going to take this moment and the reflection of it to improve in the areas to bring more people together to understand what that really meant.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you. I'm sure I'll see you a bunch. Okay.
Oh, that's good.
Hi. Hey, folks. We're back here. I was just interviewing. I know you chatted with former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy not too long ago. We were just talking a bit about his thoughts on JD Vance, of course, now the official nominee for vice president, and, of course, the attempted assassination just about 48 hours ago now against former President Trump. I want to walk you over. We've got a lot of delegates here in the hall, and you can tell that it's kind of picking back up a little bit. The music is back up. The crowds are filling back in. I'm going to guide our amazing photographer, Mark Ringo, back this way. Forgive my back. But I wanted to get a sense from folks as we're down here on the floor as to how this moment feels, as to what this is like, given the events that have made history now over the course of the last couple of days here. And one of the things that I consistently hear, and I'm going to have Mark and I kind of backpedal over this way, one of the things that I consistently hear about is people saying, the attempted assassination is top of mind for so many of them. This mood, however, is still celebratory. It is still a moment to come together. And there's a theme that I've heard again and again, and that theme is unity. The idea that the former president has said he ripped up that convention speech. He's rewriting it. He said it was a rip-roar, in his words, extremely tough on President Biden. Now, he says in this new series of interviews that's out that he wants to extend that olive branch. You're seeing that in a couple of different ways. So, for example, Nikki Haley, his former political rival, has been invited to speak on stage not too long from now. And you've also got, of course, that meeting, according to the Kennedy campaign, that happened between former President Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the independent candidate for president. I want to introduce you here to Daryl from North Carolina. And Daryl, you and I were chatting just a couple of minutes ago about this moment, the Trump-Vance ticket, and your thoughts on the next generation of Republicans.
Yes, I thought the Vance selection was a perfect selection. I think it was great to bring in that new, younger voter to the Republican Party and show them that we are not the party of, you know, all these things the Democrats try to say we are, that we are the party of the future and the party of now.
What is the message that you want to see from former President Trump this week?
Unification. I think what he went through Saturday was just horrific. That should never happen in the country that we live in. But for him to go through that and the way he went through it, to me, how he just responded so quickly, that's to me a sign of a leader. The John Wayne kind of guy we've always looked for in America is a lead America, is that John Wayne guy that just fights for, you know, for American freedom. So that's the most important thing to me is freedom in America.
Daryl, thank you so much for your thoughts. I really appreciate that. I know that my friend and colleague, Jacob Soboroff, is on the floor, but I've also found another colleague, Vaughn Hilliard. Stand by. We'll come to you in a second. But Sobo, I hear you're chatting with another delegate somewhere around here. Talk us through it.
Just like the Oscars, Hallie, they need seat fillers when delegates get up to go do things. I've now joined the Ohio delegation. I'm chit-chatting with them about what is really, in all seriousness, a very big night with JD Vance, the senator from your great state, becoming the vice presidential nominee after being picked by former President Trump. Tell me your name. What do you do? What's your reaction to the selection of JD Vance?
My name is Allison Zwicker, and I'm here from Youngstown, Ohio. So JD is like a native to us. We're so proud of him. I can't be happier.
How do you square the circle that JD Vance, at one point he wasn't supportive of Donald Trump. I don't think that's a secret. He said some pretty nasty things about him. He's come sort of full circle and has really embraced him. What do you make of that?
Well, I honestly think that there's a lot of people that didn't support Donald Trump.
Were you one of them?
No, I went in 2016, I was a supporter.
You're a diehard.
I'm a diehard Trump girl, yes.
I got to ask you about the attempted assassination of former President Trump over the weekend. An awful moment for the country, obviously a terrifying moment for former President Trump and his family. Everybody's talking about that this is going to change the sort of the tone and the tenor of the race. Do you think so? And if so, how so?
Well, it was very sobering to be coming in. We were in South Dakota, heard the news. We were flying in the next day. It did change the mood a little bit. But now I feel like we're stronger than ever. We have more resolve than ever before. And we just love our president, how strong he is.
Do you think change is possible, the tone and the tenor of the race, or is it going to all go back to how it was before?
You know, I would love to see everybody be a little bit more unified. It's a shame that we're so polarized anymore, and no one can come together. And that needs to change. It really does.
I think it's hard to disagree with that. Really nice to talk to you. Have a fun time at the convention, and congratulations to your great state.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Hallie, back to you.
Jacob Soboroff, thank you so much. Not too far behind me there with the Ohio delegation. I teased Vaughn Hilliard would be joining us, and here he is. And Vaughn, you've been doing so much reporting, including talking with somebody who has been one of the, I think, most publicly outspoken advocates for Ohio Senator JD Vance to get on the ticket, and that is the former president's son, Donald Trump Jr. He's campaigned with him. He has tweeted and put out videos about him online about what he believes, what a patriot he would be on the ticket. You talked with Donald Trump Jr. not too long ago. Walk us through it.
Right. Don Jr., I think, is an important person in this family dynamic because he, more than the rest of the family, has been very involved politically, right? While Eric and him are still involved in the Trump organization, Don Jr. has been out on the campaign trail, campaigning for down-ballot candidates, Senate candidates, House candidates. One of those people back in 2022 was JD Vance himself. It was just 2 years ago that he narrowly won a Republican primary, and Donald Trump endorsed him again at the urging of Don Jr. It was a crowded matchup in Ohio for that Republican seat, and with the backing of Don Jr., at the urging of Don Jr. and Donald Trump's endorsement, ultimately JD Vance became the guy, and over the last 2 years, they've shared an advisor, a political advisor, and really they have been really connected at the hip in terms of their messaging. And the message after the apparent assassination there, the attempted assassination on Saturday from Don Jr., placing the blame on Joe Biden and Democrats' messaging, was exactly what we heard from JD Vance. And just 2 days ago, it was on social media that Don Jr. was still pressing JD Vance to be the pick. Don Jr. got his man, and they're similar ages. And so I think generationally, Don Jr. feels like he has somebody who is not only a political ally, but also a friend in this role.
And I see one of the delegates behind you, Vaughn, holding up. Hi there, ma'am. Ma'am, holding up one of these signs. Do you mind if I take a look at your sign? We're live on NBC News now.
Absolutely.
What's your name?
I'm Sarah Reedy Jones from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us. I saw your sign. This is the theme of tonight. Obviously, there is so much hanging over tonight after that attempted assassination just 48 hours ago. And yet, officials have said they will continue with the programming, including an issue that is important to so many voters, and that is the economy. I see you wrote in here the word please.
Absolutely. I am a new mom. 3 weeks ago, I adopted a son, and thank you. And we are feeling the difference. Like, we are making choices now. We're looking at peanut butter versus going out, you know. So talking about how we can bring that economic prosperity, because 4 years ago it was different. And so I want, as a mom and as a family, to say, can we do better? So
thank you so much for chatting with us. The impromptu live interview, I appreciate it. That's how it happens here on the convention floor. We're going to sneak in a very quick break, but don't go anywhere. Our special coverage live from Milwaukee on NBC News Now continues right after this. We are back now with our live coverage here of the Republican National Convention, and this is the stage where it's all going to go down, where we expect to see, of course, former President Trump make his remarks, his new running mate, now officially no longer the presumptive nominee, JD Vance, the senator from Ohio, just to give you the land. The Ohio delegation is back that way. And Jacob Soboroff is sitting with, Jacob, if I had to guess, maybe the Texas delegation, given the atmospherics over there?
How could you have ever guessed, Hallie? How could you have ever guessed? Here I am in the middle of I will never forget, in 2016, being in the middle of the Texas delegation. And the number one clue, are these technically Stetsons, or what do you call these hats?
They are not Stetsons, but...
Can you tell I'm from L.A.?
Yeah, L.A. Oh, woohoo!
Let me ask. We joke, but this is a very serious time. The former president of the United States survived an assassination attempt. He said he wants to bring the country together. How are you feeling about sort of the state of the race and the state of the party right now?
The state of the Republican Party? I think we're very united. I think we're ready to do what we need to do to make sure that America becomes the country that we want it to be, and I think Trump's the man to do it.
What do you do for a living?
Oh, I'm a retired female Army veteran.
Thank you for your service.
And I'm a Bexar County Republican women president.
What are the issues that are most important to you coming from, you said Bexar County?
Yes, I'm coming from Bexar County
Bexar County.
What are the issues that matter most to you? Why are you here supporting former President Trump and now Ohio Senator JD Vance?
Oh, they are wonderful. I'm going to tell you, it's God sent that we still have President Trump in order for him to be our president. He's already won because of this attempt on his life. So they just messed up. He is the president, next president. And the border is my concern, and veteran benefits, veterans. He's always taken care of us. He did when he was in office. I know some bills that he passed that I really enjoyed, like we can go anywhere to receive medical care, where veterans used to have to wait and die.
And I've heard that issue all over the country. And I have to thank you as well. Of course, Hallie, the border is a key issue, obviously, in Texas. 2/3 of the border in the United States run through one of the biggest states in the union. I'm grateful to be here with my friends from the Texas delegation. I send it back over to you, right over there.
The big secret is we're looking at Jacob Soboroff right now with the Texas delegation. Jacob, make your way on over here, pal. Come on over for a second.
Excuse me, guys.
What's so interesting as we have this conversation, and hopefully you can hear us okay, because the vibe is getting rowdy over here. The issue of immigration and the issue of economy, of course, the top issues that Americans say are driving them to the polls come November. Jacob has made his way over to us. And Jacob, one of the things I wanted to ask you, you've covered a lot of conventions. How does this one feel at all different to you, based on your experience, based on the events of the last week or so?
You know, Hallie, one of the things that I've been thinking about is
I'm going to hand your mic off because we can't do this. Better, go.
One of the things I've been thinking about is how, when we were all here in 2016, is that we would hear from first folks like Stephen Miller, who was always the warm-up act to former President Trump. But then,
speaking of immigration.
Yeah, speaking of immigration, and then Trump himself. And we would hear sort of euphemistically about the policies that they were thinking about enacting. They would talk often about ending catch and release. We're talking about immigration with the folks from Texas. Ending catch and release ultimately ended up being the family separation policy. And of course, I covered that very closely. 5,000 children were separated from their parents deliberately by the administration. And what I wonder is there something like that we should be listening for that we don't know is coming from this administration, that what they're going to be talking about up there will ultimately become the signature policy of this administration? I think not everybody knew what the incoming Trump administration was going to do back in 2016. Now we know them. But what might we hear over the course of these next few days? It's something that we could be talking about over the course of the next 4 years. And I don't think we'll know the answer to that until we're to Friday and beyond.
Jacob Soboroff, thank you. I'm going to let you go do what you do so well. I'll give you your microphone back. Your producer, Arnie Hekala, has it. Go for it over there.
Thanks, you.
Jacob. We'll talk more tonight. One of the key issues, of course, as Jacob talks about, is the policy piece of this, in many ways laid out on this stage behind me here. I'd move around and show you, but I'm a little bit tucked in at this point, given the crowd of people coming back in, and that is because the primetime session now of the Republican National Convention's first night is set to kick off just minutes from now. We've already seen some of the most critical highlights, of course, of this first day. That is the official nomination, that roll call vote of former President Donald Trump, putting him, as they say, over the top for the delegates that he needed to officially get that nomination. The third time in his political career that has happened. Of course, the first under circumstances like these, just days removed from that assassination attempt against him. We're going to have much more coverage continuing right here on NBC News right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.